The top section of the Visualizations pane allows us to choose or to change visualizations, to change, for example, a column chart to a bar chart, or to change a card to a map. Then below that, we have different possibilities based on the visualization selected. First, we have fields, which allow us to work specifically with the fields in this visualization. Here we have, for example, on this axis, store number name. I can remove the field, I can rename the field if I need to. And I can choose whether to show items with no data. I can also apply filters, which we'll talk about later in the course. On my second option is to switch to the tab for formatting. Here I have general formatting, including the position of this visualization on the page, its size, and the alt text that I would want to supply for somebody who is using, for example, a screen reader. I have an x-axis that can be on or off. If I turn it off, notice that I no longer have the store numbers and names, but if I do have an x-axis, I can choose the color and text size of the x-axis information, that font that's being used. And whether I wish to have a title on that axis. Same thing's true with the y-axis. Here are my data colors. This is the default color. If I wanted to choose a different color, I can. Not a problem. If at any point I've made changes and I decide I want to roll back to where I was originally, I can revert back to the defaults. My data labels are off, it's a piece of cake to turn them on. The plot area has a particular level of transparency. I can also add an image behind it. I can do some really cool things with charts here. Almost anything I can do with Excel I can do here in Power BI in terms of what a chart looks like. If I turn the background on, then I can supply it with a color. For example, I could put a pale blue wash behind this. The aspect ratio, if I get it set and I don't want the aspect ratio to change, I can lock it in place, and then when I make this chart smaller or larger, if I want to lock its aspect ratio, I can. Note that it takes a second for that to kick in, but after it does, when I resize this, then its aspect ratio would be kept in place. Currently don't have a border. I can turn a border on this. Notice it puts a nice little border around it. Title is automatically turned on and I modified the title. If I wish, simply by changing, for example, the font color, which I'd love to. You can barely see this font. Changing its size. Modifying the alignment. I can actually change the actual name to total units this year by, and I can break up store number name. I like how that works, though. Finally, for this particular visualization, there's another choice, and that's analytics. I can put a constant line on this chart, and I'm going to add that constant line. Maybe we had a specific goal for all of our stores this year. Its value comes in at, and these are in millions, so this would be maybe 90,000. And we can choose a color for that line, and there it is. So this is an easy way to put a constant line on. Easier here, actually, than it is in Excel. And I can make this solid. It has a 50% level of transparency, and I can set a data label on that if I wish to. Notice that this visual and this visual, there are no analytics features for them. And indeed, if I'm on the Formatting tab, for example, notice that if I choose a visual that doesn't have any analytics, that it will simply tell me that there aren't any. But for charts and many of the other types of visualizations, I have the ability to build in some analytics right in here to the visual itself. These are all of the types of choices I have available when I'm formatting my visualizations. Let's add another page to our report. Simply click the plus button, and do some work with traditional charts that we're used to creating in Excel and, therefore, that our colleagues and other users are used to seeing. And that means that these are charts that don't require a lot of explanation. Charts are relatively easy to create, a little more difficult than they are in Excel because we don't just select some data and make a couple of choices or press a button or click the context menu. Here, we need to understand what our data elements are, and this is a good time for me to make a pitch about the difference between learning Power BI and using Power BI. This data set that we are using is real data that's been made anonymous, but it's actual data from stores and a couple of different store chains. And so we are working with data that isn't our own data, but it is available and accessible to us. But when you begin working in Power BI with your own data, something close to miraculous happens. When you start asking questions about your own data and creating reports and dashboards to express what you'd like to know about your data and how you'd like to represent it, the entire work of Power BI will get much easier. It certainly gets more intriguing because you've got some skin in the game and there's something at stake, but also, you have some expertise. I'm not an expert about this retail analysis sample data set. Neither are you, but you can be an expert about the data sets you are working with in your organization. So if everything we're doing feels a little remote right now, don't let that bother you. Like data modeling, like working with pivot tables, working with Power BI becomes easier the closer you are to the actual data that you're working with. And the more relevant that data is to your work. Let's create some charts. If we look, for example, at the item field list, we have category, and I'm going to click category. We get a list to begin with, which we would expect. It's a pretty short list. It has names of items on it. I'm going to make this a little larger. Let's go to our values and kick up the font and then resize this so we lose our scroll bars. That looks good. You notice then, of course, that we have no values under items. We have buyer, category, family name, and segment. I need to go find some numbers. And if we go to sales, for example, of items, notice that all of the sales data that we have, all of the data that we have is really summary data, for example, total units last year. This is calculations, so this is data that's already been summarized or rolled up for us. I'm going to add sales total units last year to our mix. There we go. Notice that some items dropped out that didn't have sales associated with them, that's fine. With our visualization selected, let's choose a pie chart. And this same information will be represented as a pie. Now, we could have done that exactly the opposite way, and it would have worked as well. For example, if we remove this visualization and we start by choosing last year's sales, then I'm going to get a chart of some kind. I can turn it into a pie right now, one big round circle. And we go down to item, and we add category. And it's still a chart. Let's make this a little larger. I'd like to make my data labels larger. That's a formatting issue. Go to Detail Labels. Those are now readable. And I'd also like to kick up my title size and change its color. If I wish, I can have a legend appear. Remember often that if you want a legend, you're not going to use data labels. If you have data labels, you won't choose a legend. So there's my legend on, and I'll turn my detail labels off. This is really small. It would be good to kick up the size of this legend. The problem is it's not going to wrap for us, and there's not a lot that we can do to have all of this legend appear. So let's turn our legend back off, our data labels back on, and they come back at the size they were when last we saw them. I can get very granular about what I wish to modify or format in a chart. And if at any point I want to revert something to the default, I can. So this just reverted the detail labels. It did not, however, revert the title. If I wanted to revert the title, then I would go down to the title text, and I can revert the title to the default. But a Ctrl+Z or undo gets me back. I like that. And I am back with my larger detail labels. Let's create another chart. I'm going to look at the average unit price. Simply drag it out there. I'm going to get a chart because I'm choosing a number, and I want to know the average unit price of items in each category. Great looking chart. Shoes are more expensive than groceries. Now from here, I'm going to choose a type of chart that's not an Excel chart. It's called a tree map, but I wanna do that while I'm right here because this is good tree map data. Tree map will take this same data and represent it similarly to a pie, but as a set of rectangles. However, here's what you can't do with a pie that I can do with a tree map. I can add more information, for example, information about buyers. And so within each of these categories, it will break down and show me the buyers in each category, a great level of detail, who the buyer is and the average price of items purchased by that buyer. Because that's what we're looking at, average unit price. So we can look at the buyers within the categories. Or we can just look at buyers, and that will give us yet another representation. We have lots and lots of buyers. And for each buyer, they represent lots of different categories. So this is pretty slick. This allows us to look at both categories and buyers' hierarchical data. And we have total units last year by category, so I'm going to rename this page category. And here is our tree map visualization, as well as a more traditional pie chart visualization to represent what we know about categories, units sold, average prices, and buyers.